Hi, I'm Brianna, and I'm the founder and managing partner at Envol Strategies. We're really excited to be joined today by Brandon, who's an employment lawyer, here to speak with us about cannabis and the implications for employers.
Hi, my name's Brandon Hillis. I'm a labor and employment lawyer at Roper Greyell, which is a labor and employment law firm here in Vancouver, BC.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you, Brandon. And I know what we're going to talk about today is specifically how cannabis legalization is going to impact employers. We're going to be sharing some of the questions that we've received over and over from employers over the last few months, and questions that I know are questions Brandon has heard as well. So we'll share the questions that we've received, and we're really lucky to have Brandon here to provide answers. To kick us off, Brandon, What does the legalization of cannabis actually mean for employers?
Well, I think the biggest thing that the legalization of cannabis means for employers is that employers have got to be more aware of the impacts and the potential impacts of marijuana and marijuana use in the workplace. There are a lot of obligations that employers have got with respect to health and safety, and in order to comply with those obligations, they need to be well aware of what marijuana use can do and the potential risks that it rises. Employees need to be aware of what their expectations are and what the consequences of use may be, and when it is not appropriate to use it.
Lots of things to dig into, so we'll dive right in. Brandon, are my obligations as an employer different when it comes to recreational cannabis use versus medical cannabis use?
Absolutely they are. One of the biggest things that employers have to deal with, and this isn't just relating to cannabis use, but to use of any drugs, is whether or not you as an employer are under a duty to accommodate. When you have someone who is a recreational cannabis user, there's not a duty to accommodate. The duty to accommodate arises often if somebody has a substance use dependency or a potential substance use dependency, or in connection with medical cannabis use. If an employee, for example, is using cannabis in connection with a disease or a disability, you will have to consider your obligations under the duty to accommodate. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to allow for cannabis use in your workplace, but it means that you do need to consider what your obligations are. It is a lot more complicated when you're dealing with a medical cannabis situation versus a recreational situation.
Interesting. And can you tell us a little bit about an employee's duty to inform you if they have a medical prescription for cannabis use?
So the advice that we give to our clients is that when you've got, if you've got a drug and alcohol program in your workplace, you should be advising employees that if you are taking any prescription, or any medication, prescription or otherwise, that has an impact on your ability to be fit for work, you should be advising your employer of that. And that's whether it's medical marijuana or whether it's strong painkillers that may cause an employee to be drowsy.
Are my employees obligated to inform me if they're using cannabis recreationally?
That's a great question. The employer's focus is going to be more on the impacts than the use. I suppose if an employee is using marijuana on the weekend, they may not have to inform their employer on Monday that they're using it, but the employer's concern, and I think we'll get into this a little bit further on, isn't so much with the use, it's with the impacts. What kind of impact does marijuana use, whether that's on a Friday, and then you've got the weekend in between the work and you get back to work on Monday, what kind of impact does that have on the workplace, or what kind of impact or potential for impact does it have if an employee is using it the morning of?
Are my employees allowed to use cannabis before work, on a break while they're at work, or sometime during the middle of that work day?
They shouldn't be. And I think if the stance that any employer should be taking, particularly employers in safety-sensitive workplaces, is that you can't be using marijuana on your way to work or on your lunch break. The mindset, and again, particularly in a safety-sensitive work environment, should really be the same as the mindset that you have about alcohol. You're not going to allow an employee working in a forestry camp or in any other sort of dangerous or safety sensitive workplace to have a beer before they start their shift or to have a beer at lunch. So you wouldn't allow an employee to spark up at lunch either.
Thanks for clarifying.
No problem.
What do I do if I suspect that an employee is under the influence of marijuana at work?
I think if you suspect an employee is under the influence of marijuana at work, there's a number of different ways that you can ultimately go with that. But I think the first thing that you would want to be doing is asking yourself, why do you think this employee is under the influence? And again, whether that's marijuana or alcohol or any other drug or a prescription painkiller. And then you probably want, the first thing I think you would want to do is talk to the employee and try to get a sense from them what's going on. Is there anything that you need to tell me? I've noticed that you've been really sluggish today, or I noticed that you've been eating all of the Doritos in the lunchroom. So what's happening here? That's always the first step, or typically that's the first step.
So if I do suspect that an employee is under the influence of marijuana at work, am I legally able to have a drug test conducted on that employee?
You can have drug tests conducted or alcohol tests conducted in a couple of different circumstances. There is reasonable cause testing, which is where the employer has reason to believe that an employee is not fit for work, that their mental state is an issue, and that's got to be based on the observation of characteristics, so the employees slurring their words or they're falling asleep at their workstation. And you've got to sort of go through an investigation process. You don't want to jump right to testing, and that's the biggest pitfall really for any employer, is that, oh, something's happened, that means you've got to go and do a test. So there's those reasonable cause situations, and then there's also another avenue of testing is called post-incident testing or post-triggering event testing. So you have an accident in the workplace. So again, a lot of this is centered around safety-sensitive work environments, but you have an accident in the workplace, and you may be able to test for drugs and alcohol after that. Again, if you think that the employee's mental state is an issue, that their fitness for duty is an issue. But in order to do that, again, there's that investigation. You've got to rule out a lot of other factors. You've got to rule out things like environmental factors, structural failures. So an employee crashes their forklift. Well, if the brakes weren't working, well then that may rule out the employee's mental state as being an issue. And again, it's where employers really do fall into these pitfalls of, okay, we had an accident. Is this a significant accident? Is there an injury? Is there a certain amount of damage? Yeah, okay, well, let's go make this guy do a test right away. And that's where you're going to have trouble.
Thanks for sharing.
Happy to.
Let's talk a little bit more about testing.
Absolutely.
We've heard that there are some pitfalls and limitations with what's actually currently available to test whether or not someone's under the influence of cannabis. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can. And I mean, I'll preface this by I'm not a scientist, but there are a lot of challenges with testing for cannabis. And you're seeing a lot of that in the news today. I think the federal government's struggling with that. Police departments are struggling with that. And that's really why conducting these investigations before you go the testing route is very important as well, because there are going to be times where you may decide, okay, I don't need to test this employee because maybe they've admitted that they smoked a joint that morning, or maybe it's so obvious because of the way that they smell and all these other indicators. But the key is you don't want to be in a situation where you're relying solely on a test to say this employee is under the influence, because testing technologies, I think, are improving, but the biggest pitfall for marijuana testing historically has been that it doesn't detect present impairment. And that's in part because there isn't a bright line figure of, okay, if you're reading at X level versus Y level, does that mean you are or you aren't impaired? A lot of what the readings will show, or what they've historically shown, is that marijuana is being used at some point in the last couple of weeks. The newer testing devices, the saliva swab devices or the oral testing devices, like what police departments are starting to roll out, they're focused on more recent use, sort of use in the last, I think, probably 8 to 24 hours typically, but it is still difficult. A positive drug test does not mean that an employee is impaired. And with that in mind, the advice that we give to our clients is that the focus isn't on, are you impaired, yes or no? It's, is there a risk here to safety in the workplace? And your focus is on mitigating those risks.
Yeah, absolutely. For a lot of our clients, they operate in very safety-sensitive environments. For example, an employee who's a truck driver or someone who's operating a forklift all during their shift. Are those employers able to insist on a zero-tolerance policy for cannabis in the workplace?
Well, a zero-tolerance policy as a concept can mean a number of different things. A zero-tolerance policy that you can't have any marijuana in your system, or is a zero-tolerance policy one strike and you're out. Zero tolerance policies on a disciplinary basis typically never work. That's just the way that the law develops or has developed. And zero tolerance policies for marijuana, again, you're focusing on whether or not you're going to be above or below those thresholds. And I think the policy that you would give to employees would be, you need to report fit for work, and fit for work means that you are not going to test positive. And if you test positive, that's a violation of our company's drug and alcohol policy.
There are currently over 700 jobs available in the cannabis industry, which means that lots of job seekers are exploring career opportunities in a brand new field that is still very gray with a lot of question marks. And I know we're hearing a lot of people asking, what should they think about or should they be concerned about pursuing a job in the cannabis industry?
I think right now, because there is so much gray, there should be concern. And I think if I were applying for a job in the cannabis industry, I would have some concerns. And those concerns will mostly relate to cross-border travel. I think we've all been reading a lot in the news these days about whether or not someone who works in that industry is going to be allowed to cross the border into the States, whether if they want to go down there for a weekend or a vacation or what have you. So that's why I would be concerned. I think if I were applying, I would want to be following the news on that very closely. I would probably want to be speaking with my employer about what they understand the situation to be, and I would probably be looking at speaking with an immigration lawyer or another specialist in that area about what it means for me. The difficulty is that we don't know what the law in the States is going to be tomorrow. So
putting it mildly.
So yeah, the long and short of it is I would be concerned. I don't have a definitive answer for whether someone who does work in the cannabis industry can or cannot travel across the border, but I'd be worried about it.
I think there'll be more to come on that, perhaps in a follow-up series as the law continues to evolve. A lot of the companies that we work with have different offices located all across Canada. Is the law around cannabis the same across the entire country?
Well, the criminal code provisions will be the same across the country. That's a federal statute. Provincially, there is a lot of common ground. There are some nuanced differences. I think that if we're getting into questions about how does this specifically affect my workplace in location X, those are probably the things that we should be discussing on an individual basis, on a company by company or issue by issue basis. A lot of these things, a lot of what we're talking about today is really general application, high level general principles. Of course, it does all change as the details change. Yeah. And that's true for as the issues become more specific or as you're thinking about how does this affect me in one jurisdiction versus another.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you do have questions specifically related to your company in one location versus another, we encourage you to reach out to Brendan and his team over at Roper Greyell. We know that you shouldn't drive under the influence of alcohol.
Right, yep.
Talk to us a little bit about driving under the influence of marijuana.
Well, that's the biggest, most obvious change in the law is that that the criminal code amendments are recognizing certain levels of marijuana in your system are going to lead to various charges. So if you're driving and you get pulled over in a roadside stop and you blow over maybe blow over isn't the right terminology, but if on a test your reading is above a certain amount of nanograms per milliliter, that's going to lead to charges, to consequences and penalties, just like driving under the influence of alcohol would be. Those levels, I suspect, will probably be subject to court challenges if those aren't already in place. So that the levels and the standards are likely to evolve in the coming years. But the long and short of it is you probably just shouldn't be driving after you smoked a joint.
Yeah. Don't drive high, don't drive drunk. How should I handle it if an employee has marijuana at their desk?
I think that as an employer, you don't have to allow that. You don't have to allow marijuana in the workplace, and you can say to the employee that that's not allowed. You can have a policy that says that's not allowed. You're not allowed to have marijuana in the office. A lot of companies now are working on revising their policies or are sending out new directives or notifications or memos to employees as a reminder that, hey, marijuana is legal, but this doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all at the workplace. and you're not allowed to use marijuana at company-sponsored events. So the company Christmas party, the company summer barbecue, you're not allowed to use marijuana there. You're not allowed to bring marijuana there. And I think that's an appropriate response by employers.
That's a great response, and I think that is something that we have question marks about, and that a lot of the companies that we work with do as well, because you'll often provide alcohol at company-sponsored events. Should you now also be providing marijuana at company-sponsored events?
The advice that should we provide company-sponsored marijuana? No. The advice that we're giving to employers is that you can have alcohol at events, and even at that, it's all very qualified. If alcohol's at a company event, it is under the expectation that you're going to consume responsibly, that you're going to take a ride home, that you're going to stay downtown as opposed to going back home. So it's not a free for all with alcohol at company events. And as for marijuana, no, I think the answer is no. You certainly don't need to provide it, and you don't need to allow it. And if I were an employer, I would not be allowing marijuana at events. One of the big things, I suppose, that we need to consider, and maybe one of the reasons why alcohol and marijuana do get treated differently, is that with alcohol, you know what you're getting. With marijuana, one of the challenges and one of the reasons why employers should be concerned and be thinking about a risk mitigation approach is that you don't always know the potency of the marijuana that you're using. And that may change now as marijuana is being legalized, but for the time being, you just don't know what the potency is. You don't know what the effect is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying and giving some peace of mind around that.
Happy to help.
So, Brandon, we have plants all around our office, including one right here.
Right.
Now that marijuana is legal, do we have to permit marijuana plants to be present in the office?
No.
Okay.
And it's that simple.
Full stop. No marijuana plants in the office. Tell us a little bit more about duty to accommodate for employers when it comes to medical cannabis.
So the duty to accommodate is probably one of the more complicated areas of what we do, of labor and employment law. There's not really a formula where, if this, then that, if that, then this. The duty to accommodate's got to be very individualized to the certain circumstances that you're dealing with. There are things that the duty to accommodate does and doesn't mean. The duty to accommodate doesn't mean that you have to tolerate an employee being at work under the when they're not fit for duty, when they don't get to just smoke marijuana at work, for example. And that's particularly true in safety sensitive workplaces. That's seen, the potential risk is seen as an undue hardship. If an employer is faced with an employee who says that they've got a medical prescription that they need to use marijuana in connection with some sort of a medical condition. So you see sometimes it's oils to deal with arthritis, or smoking marijuana to deal with glaucoma, or the list is really endless. You don't need to have that. That doesn't mean that person immediately gets that authorization to use marijuana whenever and wherever they want during the workday. But what you've got to do is you've got to sit down and you've got to do an investigation into this, and you've got to see what it is that you're dealing with on an individualized basis. An important thing to remember is that the duty to accommodate is a two-way street. Employers bear the lion's share of the burden, but employees have obligations too. They need to come forward with a request for accommodation, they need to provide information necessary, and they need to accept what is a reasonable accommodation. You can't hold out for the perfect solution. So I think one thing that I would typically be asking about, if an employee says, I have to use CBD oil or I have to use marijuana because of condition X, I would be saying, okay, well, where's your prescription for that? Who prescribed it? What else have you tried, if anything? If you haven't, why not? And you go down that path of just gathering information. You try to get as much information as you can, and then you make a decision. And the decision might be that the employee is off work, that they're put on a medical leave of absence, or the accommodation might be just that we can't accommodate you. This is an undue hardship in our workplace, so we're sorry, but that's it.
Yeah, it does sound like it's very case by case specific. So if you have a specific situation with an employee that you are curious about, we encourage you to reach out to Brandon and his team at Roper Greyell to discuss it a little bit further and make sure that you're fully compliant.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now that cannabis has been legalized, what are the key things that every employer should have in place?
The key thing that employers should be keeping in mind at all times is that under workers' compensation legislation, they have an obligation to provide a workplace that is safe and healthy. And that means making sure that workers on any work site are working in a manner or are present in a manner that's not going to cause a risk to them, to the public, to customers, to coworkers, and that includes making sure that employees are not impaired or potentially impaired by drugs or alcohol, such as or cannabis specifically. What employers should be doing is, I think that the key thing is really that employers should be communicating their expectations to their employees. And that can be something that can be a brief memo or an email that goes out to the company and says, listen, we know marijuana is legalized. Our concerns about it are still the same. It is still a substance that has consequences for your ability to work in a productive manner, in a safe manner, in a healthy manner. So here's our expectations. You're not going to have the marijuana plant at your desk. You're not going to be blazing at lunchtime. Employers who've got drug and alcohol policies should be considering whether those policies need to be updated to make sure that the language is current with the fact that cannabis is legalized, and also to make sure that more generally their policies are up to date with testing requirements. Employers who don't have policies should be thinking about whether or not they need one in their workplace. But the biggest piece of advice that I give to my clients is that as an employer, your concern on October 16th wasn't that an employee is smoking a joint and it's illegal. I don't think any employer is losing sleep over the fact that you might have bought a bag of weed from a guy in the corner. The concern on the 16th and on the 17th is what does that mean for my workplace? And those concerns are still the same. So employers, should know that those concerns still exist, and that legalization doesn't give employees a free ride to show up to work under the influence or potentially under the influence.
Some great key action items that every employer should be taking today if you haven't already. Brendan, thank you so much for coming in today to share with us your expertise on cannabis legalization, specifically for employers. I know you've done a really good job of putting our minds at ease and sharing some really great tools and context into how employers should be navigating this changing landscape in cannabis legalization. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, if anyone does have specific questions or they want to dig into a specific duty to accommodate or scenario in their organization, we will provide Brandon's contact information, and we encourage you to reach out to Brandon and his team over at Roper Greyell. You're also, of course, welcome to reach out to our team of HR experts here at Envol.
Thank you.